elected representatives.
For more on today's ruling, let's bring in Rebecca Cook, Professor Emerita at the University of Toronto, specializing in international reproductive and sexual health law. Rebecca, thanks for joining us this evening.
Good to be here, Mark.
So wanted to first get your reaction to everything that's happened today.
Well, indeed, the U.S. Supreme Court did take away a fundamental right of women to decide whether or not they want to continue with their pregnancy. It's a very historic, devastating decision that will have really terrible, catastrophic impact, particularly in Mississippi, which is the poorest state in the Union. And it will have a very discriminatory impact on minority women, poor women, and rural women.
In terms of what happens next, I know there's been talk of expanding a Supreme Court, other moves obviously in place in the fall as Americans back to the polls in the fall. Talk about what could happen next in terms of reversing the decision that we saw today.
Well, it probably is too soon for that to make any predictions, and it really depends upon how the pro-choice community galvanizes at the polls in the fall, and whether they return to the House, a Democratic House, and to the Senate, a Democratic Senate. So it really all depends. If they do get large majorities in both the House and the Senate, they could well pass the Women's Health Protection Act, which would give a statutory protection to women's right to choose.
Rebecca, we've also heard rumblings with the Supreme Court in terms of other rights, other women's rights being taken away, potentially contraception, other possibilities. What's your take on all of that? Where do you stand on all of that?
Well, there was certainly a debate in the decision. Justice Alito said it won't affect other privacy rights or components of privacy rights. Justice Thomas said that those other rights are on the chopping block as well. So that's all to be determined, but it is very concerning.
Rebecca, are you expecting the potential for a flood of American women making their way over the border to Canada?
Yes, I think that could well happen. I think there's also will be problems about women's rights to travel. I'm sure states will introduce legislation that will try to prevent women from traveling to other countries. But I should say, as Canadians, we should be very proud of our Supreme Court in protecting women's security of the person in accessing abortion services here in Canada. Our decision is a very sound decision. Our court doesn't interpret our charter in terms of how it was written in the past, but it has a doctrine called the living tree doctrine, that you interpret the charter according to how it grows, how in the court, the U.S. Supreme Court literally was interpreting the Constitution as it was written, or the 14th Amendment as it was written in 1868.
Rebecca Cook, Professor Emeritus at the University of Toronto, thank you so much for speaking with us this evening. Appreciate your insight.
Thank you, Mark.
And within hours of the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, hundreds of protesters gathered on Capitol grounds. The crowd includes dueling demonstrators, both anti-abortion and pro-choice activists. Police in the nation's capital are bringing in additional officers and mobilizing in anticipation of the protests growing outside the U.S. Supreme Court. Protests are expected in more than 50 cities across the U.S. this evening.